Well, my friends, today is the day. Today it is happening. Today it's here. Your special opportunity to join the Live Inspired in-studio membership community where we come together once a month on an exclusive webcast. We choose intentionally to take pause, to focus on what is most important to you, to overcome the challenges that you face, and to ensure that you have the tools in place to live into your best life, both personally and professionally. Registration for In-Studio happens only a few times a year, and it's open to the public. That means you for a very limited time right now. So don't miss this opportunity to register as it closes within the next 48 hours. 48 hours. The time is ticking already. 48 hours. Now it's 47 hours, 59 minutes, 54 seconds. Don't miss this opportunity. Let's do life together. Go right now, learn more about In-Studio, and register today before it closes. You can learn more at johnolearyinspires.com/join. Again, it is johnolearyinspires.com/join. I can't wait, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. John is the #1 national best-selling author of the book On Fire. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, and he's the host of the Live Inspired podcast. John interviews extraordinary individuals on their life story so that you can wake up from accidental living and more fully live your life story. Here's your host, John O'Leary.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. We in our office get an awful lot of opportunities to read and to research an awful lot of presenters and thought leaders and researchers. I've seen my office moved many times. I've seen them inspired and encouraged and looking forward to many of the guests that we've had on. And yet, in the years of us doing our Live Inspired podcast, I've never had every single individual as excited as they are about today's guest, about today's topic, about what it meant for them, and what it means for each of us on this call today. So you ladies, you gentlemen, you friends, you followers are going to be inspired. You are going to be fired up with today's guest. Let me give you a little bit of Meik's background. Meik Wiking is one of today's most influential researchers on happiness. He founded the world's first happiness research institute in 2013 in Copenhagen, Denmark. He consults cities and governments and organizations around the world on happiness. He's the author of several books, including the international bestsellers, The Little Book of Hygge. I've got it right here. It was awesome. The Little Book of Hygge. I've read that too. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the upcoming, The Art of Making Memories. These books have sold more than 1 million copies worldwide and have been translated into more than 35 languages. Meik Wiking is an internationally respected speaker on happiness. He's known for his ability to convey complex ideas and theories to a wide audience and has spoken in more than 40 countries around the world. Meik Wiking, as our listeners get ready to buckle up, open up their minds and their hearts, I want to thank you for making time for us today. So my friends, please welcome to the Live Inspired podcast, my friend, Meik Wiking.
Thanks, John. What an amazing and friendly introduction. But remember that the key to happiness is also having low expectations. So
Well, it's one key to happiness among many others that we will be unpacking together. Although today, I would encourage our listeners to elevate expectations. I think too frequently we think too little of ourselves and too little of life. And you remind us of the grandeur of a warm cup of tea, of a lit candle burning in the quiet corner of our bedroom. The little things in life aren't. But Meik, before you were doing this incredible life-changing work around the world, I would imagine growing up in Denmark as a little boy, you weren't thinking later on in life that this is the work that you were called to. So I want you to take the train way back to the station. Talk about growing up as a little one.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. So I think I had a very fortunate background. I mean, being born in Denmark, and for those of your listeners that are not familiar with Denmark, it is essentially everything that Bernie Sanders dreams of. So there is free healthcare and there is free university education. You even get paid to go to school. And obviously growing up, I wasn't aware of how big a privilege that is. That was something that came later on. But I've always been interested in people. I've always been interested in why we do what we do. And I think I've always been interested in quality of life. Understanding how we can create good conditions for good lives, how can we create better decisions that enables us to flourish. And then 6-7 years ago, I was reading the World Happiness Report, which was commissioned by the UN. And again, Denmark was doing quite well in these rankings. I think back in 2012, we were in first place. I just thought, why is it that Denmark is always doing well in these happiness rankings? There should be somebody in Denmark trying to pool that knowledge and understand what drives happiness and so on. And then I thought, maybe I should do that. And that became sort of the first step into a now 6-year journey that have been incredibly fun and interesting and rewarding. So that was the speedy train.
I've read, of course, much of your work, and I've listened, I think, to just about every interview you've ever done. So I really do feel like I'm across the table from a friend right now. Who were some of the men, the women, the leaders that you looked up to growing up, though? Like, who are some of your great influencers?
Oh, I think I've always been inspired by explorers and pioneers and scientists that were interested in exploring the world, whether that was, the dark areas on the map or scientific inventions, trying to sort of push technology and humankind further. Today, I also feel it's incredibly interesting to see what's going on with space exploration. And I'm just amazed of sort of the human race ability to keep exploring the world and trying to push limits for understanding. And to me, that is interesting and fun and rewarding to be part of. So we're not going into outer space, but we're perhaps going into the inner space and trying to understand what drives human happiness. And that's the space mission that we're on.
Well, I think the idea, whether you are looking through a telescope or a microscope, that there's an awful lot to explore in both spots. You've been referred to before, I've read this in several different articles, as the Indiana Jones of happiness. So let's talk about happiness right now, because it sounds so vague. And it sounds kind of like puppy dogs and rainbows and a very difficult thing to get your hands grasped around. So how do you measure happiness?
Yeah. And that's one of the core questions we work with. I usually say that we're trying to solve 3 questions at the Happiness Research Institute. And one of them is the one you just mentioned. How the heck can we measure something as vague and subjective as well-being, happiness, or the good life? And secondly, we try to understand why are some people happier than others. And thirdly, we try to understand how we can improve quality of life. And I get that question a lot. It sounds vague. It sounds very fluffy. It sounds very much like we have a room full of puppies at the Institute. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to have a scientific approach to happiness and trying to understand, what are the evidence, what are the patterns, what are the common denominators when we look at data, when we look at studies in what drives well-being and quality of life. And I get it. I've also previously been skeptic about the ability to measure something as unmeasurable as happiness. But I think that people at the same time also forget that we are trying to study a lot of other things that are also subjective and to some extent unmeasurable, like stress, like depression, like anxiety. And I don't see any good argument for it should be more difficult to study positive emotions compared to negative emotions. But we fully acknowledge that happiness is an umbrella term. So you have one perception of what happiness or the good life is, and I have another one. So what we always do is we break happiness down into different components. So we look both at sort of an overall life satisfaction, taking a step back, evaluating your life, which is a very sort of stable dimension. But we can also look at how happy do people feel right now, or we can look at a spectrum of emotions. Did your listeners feel, angry, happy, sad, lonely, worried, stressed? And those are two different dimensions of happiness. But of course, if you're every day with a lot of positive emotions, probably also have a higher level of life satisfaction. And then ideally what we do is we like to follow large groups of people over time and use longitudinal studies to understand when people's circumstances change. If people get promoted or fired or married or divorced, how does that impact different dimensions of happiness?
There's so much to unpack there as you are studying all of this. What are you, Meik, learning about happiness?
I think first and foremost that we can actually capture happiness. We do have some valuable, valid metrics that are capturing what people see happiness as. So the metrics that we are using, we find what we would expect. If people become sick, they are less happy. If your children become sick, you are less happy. If you become unemployed, you are less happy. If you have good quality, tight, relationships with your spouse, with your friends, with your community, you are happier. So what we would expect, we would find, we find. But at the same time, there's a lot of still dark or blank spots on the map. There's a lot we don't know yet. But to me, some of the interesting findings have also been that we can see there is a genetic component when it comes to happiness or well-being. So we can see that people are simply born more or less happy. So in the US, you have a really cool twin register at the University of Minnesota. And also, as I understand it, from a period in the US where it was allowed for two different sets of parents to adopt one twin each. Wow. So in that circumstance, you have, identical genetic material that are brought up under different circumstances. And from those studies, we can see non-identical twins do not have similar happiness levels. There's no correlation between their life satisfaction. But for the identical twins, there is a correlation, sort of a medium strong one. So even though one might be married and employed and the other one might be divorced and unemployed, there's still a correlation between their happiness levels. So I first found that quite surprising. But then in the second round, I realized, well, if we look at mental illnesses like depression or schizophrenia, we can also see there is a genetic component. So obviously there should be one for positive emotions as well.
Yeah. So as you look at Denmark, one of the happiest countries in the world, this is a difficult question, but here it comes. How much of that do you think is based on the genetic disposition of the former Vikings, Meik Wiking, versus, no, man, it's our behaviors, it's our lifestyle, it's our decisions, it's the way we light candles and take time to enjoy and breathe in life?
So I think the genetic component is a minor one. Huh. We can see it as other studies have shown that it is a component because when you look at, for example, Americans with Scandinavian ancestors, they do report high levels of life satisfaction when you control for the socioeconomic factors. But to me, the main explanation for why Denmark, along with the other Nordic countries, do well in the happiness rankings is the Nordic model. I think it's also important to underline that these rankings are based on averages. So we call them the happiest countries in the world, but you could also turn it the other way around and say perhaps they're the least unhappy countries. And what we, for instance, see is that Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland are relatively good at reducing causes for unhappiness through unemployment benefits, through access to healthcare, through access to university education, and so on. Yeah, so I think it's the Nordic model that enables people to experience high levels of life satisfaction. But of course, there's also challenges in the Nordic countries. When you have a high national average, You of course have people that are above, but you also have people that are below that average. And of course, not everything is perfect here, but I think there is some things that work well that other countries can take inspiration from.
Meik, when you created the Happiness Institute, did you ever fathom that there would be individuals and organizations and government representatives from South Korea and Mexico and the United States and royal families visiting you to learn what this is and what it might mean to them?
No, to be honest, where we are today with the Institute is beyond what I had hoped and dreamed for when we started. But it's, what drove me in the beginning was just the curiosity. It was just, I wanted to work with this field. I thought it was incredibly interesting. And if I was able to make a career out of that at the same time, that would be an additional bonus. But it was the curiosity and sort of becoming an explorer in this field that was the driving force, and it still is today. But of course, it's wonderful to be able to try and impact sort of the course of a country in terms of hopefully creating policies and creating infrastructure and creating a framework that will allow people to flourish more than they are currently doing.
Part of that is putting into practice what you teach. And in the little book of Hygge, and am I saying that appropriately? Yes?
Well done.
Good. My Danish is almost as strong as my English. I'm glad I crushed the first word. The little book of Hygge. It is a New York Times bestseller. It's an incredible read, Meik. First, can you tell our listeners what Hygge means, and then explain how Hygge can be a noun, a verb, and an adjective?
Okay. Yeah, so there are many definitions of Hygge. I think to me, one of the best shorter definitions is the art of creating a nice atmosphere. But it's, these situations where we feel relaxed, where we feel at peace, where we feel a sense of togetherness, where we might enjoy some simple pleasures. But it's all about the atmosphere. And of course, I mean, that also happens in the US and Canada and everywhere else around the world. But what might be uniquely Danish is we have a word that describes that situation. And also Danes see it as part of our sort of national culture and part of the national DNA, maybe the same way that Americans see freedom as something inherently American. But it is a noun, but as you mentioned, it's also a verb and an adjective. So as a verb, I could also use it and say, "Hey, John, you want to come over and hygge on Friday?" And then during the week we'll talk about how hyggelig, that's the adjective, that Friday is going to be. Then on Friday we'll talk about how hyggelig this is. And then on Monday we'll talk about how hyggelig Friday was. So it's being talked a lot about among Danes, and it's sort of to some extent, the sort of key success parameter when you do social gatherings. Your spouse will ask you, "Do you think the guests had a hyggelig time tonight?" Really,
it's that big of a deal. Honestly.
It is.
So give us an example of what might allow your spouse to say, "Gosh, that was very Hygge. Well done." They left it on fire with Hygge. What happened during that cocktail party to make sure that we lived into that?
It's a very good question. I think we sensed that they were relaxed, that they were themselves, that they were having a nice time, but and sort of relaxing at the same time. So it's also been called socializing for introverts. So where there is a strong sense of harmony in the group, where there is a strong sense of togetherness, but without sort of somebody taking the main spotlight and without sort of dominating the conversation or sort of competing in different areas. So yeah, I know it's almost as vague as a definition of happiness, but yeah. I think that's one of the closest things I can come to.
Well, you wrote a book about how we can practice this. Give us some practical tips that many of our listeners are from North America, Australia, countries like this. How can we practice Hygge in our daily lives?
One simple thing is Danes, because of Hygge and because of the importance of atmosphere for Hygge, Danes burn a lot of candles. So we actually use twice as many candles as number 2 in Europe, which is Austria, because lighting is important to create a nice atmosphere, and candles give off a softer, warmer light that is considered more hyggelig. You would get the same light from a fireplace, for instance. Now, I'm not in a very sort of hyggelig light now because I have a sort of bulb in the room, but lighting a candle would be one of the sort of easy steps. And interestingly, after I wrote about Hygge, I had a conversation with a Canadian journalist called Yannick, who had also, like you, read about Hygge and the love of candles among Danes. And he, after that, went out and he bought some chandeliers and started to light candlelight dinners at home. And he got teased by his sons. He and his wife have 3 sons. And the boys were like, "Dad, what's going on with the candles? We leave." But then he says, over time, the boys, they started to light the candles for dinner. Mm-hmm. And he also says that now their dinner time lasts 15 to 20 minutes longer because the atmosphere around the table is different. And now, instead of just sitting down and quickly eating their food, the boys are sort of talking about how their day was and puts them in a different mood. So I think and I'm fascinated by those stories where you create a simple change in the setting, and then it has an effect on people's behavior. Of course, we're not gonna see an increase of 10% in Americans' happiness by lighting candles around the dinner table. But I think it's just a very sort of easy step that could perhaps have an impact on how families interact.
Well, it's one of many you share in the book of Hygge, which I really can't recommend highly enough. And I've never noticed that we did this as a family, but before Christmas, it's common practice to have a little wreath in the middle of your table. There's 4 candles on it. And then week by week, leading all the way up to Christmas Day, you light 1 candle. And by the end of it, you have 4 lit. And it changes the conversation around the dinner table with 4 crazy little kids that I have. It settles the conversation down. It does go a little bit longer, and I've never even known why. And Meik Wiking, you just explained exactly why, man. It's really cool. You gave a TED Talk that blew me away because you shared something called the happiness-suicide paradox. Tell our listeners what the happiness-suicide paradox is.
Right. So the happiness-suicide paradox is the paradox that it might be more difficult to be unhappy in an otherwise happy country. So if we take the individual US states, we can see that states with a higher level of life satisfaction also have a slightly higher suicide rate. So Hawaii is one of the states that report the highest level of life satisfaction, but also have one of the highest levels of suicide. I look at it also within Denmark. A lot of people think that Denmark has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Fortunately, that's not the case. It used to be true. So in 1980, Denmark had a suicide rate of 40 per 100,000. Now we have a suicide rate of 9 per 100,000.
Wow.
So it's been cut to around 25% of what it was. So Denmark is now in place 106 in the global suicide rates levels. So it's Sri Lanka that currently has the highest suicide rate in the world. We're around 36. But still, I would love the Danish level to be 0. And that it is not, and of course that prompted me to look a little bit into that, and one of the reasons might be that that it is more difficult to be unhappy in a happier country, because your own unhappiness becomes, there's a stronger contrast when you look at your life and you look at your life satisfaction up against a backdrop of happy people.
I find that so ironic. So when you are surrounded by people who are, in quotes, successful and happy in their relationships and content in their life, that it actually has a greater likelihood of making you feel less happy, less successful, less content in your own. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, there's a risk of that. And what we can see across a lot of different studies is that what you described there seems to exist, that there is sort of an element of social comparison. So when you take beauty or wealth or success or happiness, that our satisfaction with these different domains are also impacted in how we see our peers, our neighbors, our friends, our family doing. So for instance, when it comes to income, we see in some studies that people care not only about absolute income, so how much are they able to consume, but they also care about relative income. So how much money am I making compared to my wife's brother, for instance, or my neighbor.
Right.
And of course, that becomes a challenge because if we care more about the position in the social hierarchy, then say if the US economy doubled and everybody got twice as much income, maybe we would still be stuck in the same place in the social hierarchy, which is one of the reasons why we see countries becoming richer without people necessarily becoming happier.
Well, I think it's exemplified everywhere. If you look back to our parents and our grandparents, for the most part, the vast majority of us are doing much, much, much better financially, regardless of the reports. I mean, the reality is we have 5 TVs in our homes and 3 cars in our garage. That's not everywhere. But Americans in particular and the rest of the world are in a much different place financially today than we were decades ago. And yet happiness is not tracking alongside of it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think one of the reasons is this, that social comparisons matter, that relative income matters. Another reason is that we are unfortunately very good at increasing the expectations, or we are good at raising the bar for what we feel we need in order to be happy. If all your friends have those 5 TVs and those 3 cars, then that is going to be your benchmark. And also, if you have the 5 TVs and the 3 cars, maybe you feel that's the new normal and you would not be otherwise happy with that one car you might be very happy with when you're first.
Right.
I don't know, do you get a driver's license when you're 16 or 18 in the US?
16 is right.
Very happy to have a car at that time, right? And it could be any car.
Correct.
But now your sort of your bar for what is normal or what you feel is enough raises. So that is a pitfall. And earlier on, I was talking about this, fantastic thing of the human race that we continuously sort of push the bar. But this is sort of the backside of that medal, if you can say that, American expression.
Yeah.
That we constantly raise the bar for what we feel we need, and then unfortunately there seems to be no one accomplishment that we will achieve or no goal that we will achieve that will make us eternally happy. But maybe that makes us embrace the old cliche of enjoying the journey more than the destination. So it might be actually a good thing in the end.
Talk about social media and how that plays into what you are speaking about. So we were talking about our neighbors or our community. What social media does, though, is it amplifies both. And it's not just our direct neighbors. Now the neighbors are those all around us, all around the world with whom we are comparing our lives. So how does social media either positively or negatively or somewhere in between affect our level of happiness?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that because we're actually trying to ask that same question these days. So we've just started a new study where we look at both the risks but also the opportunities of digital well-being. But we've done a previous experiment that shows the risk, and it comes out of that exact question that you also raised. And our thought was, and this was back in 2015, I think we did the experiment. As you say, social media, constant bombardment of honeymoons and marathons and people living amazing lives and show us the amazing pictures of when it happens. And it can be a really tough contrast to be comparing your life up against. So we wanted to explore, if a sort of digital detox would impact happiness and well-being. So we had almost 1,100 people sign up for an experiment. And we started out with then running different happiness surveys among them, looking at their happiness levels on different dimensions. Mm-hmm. And then we randomized them into two groups. So one group would continue to do as they usually do and be on social media as much as they want. And then a second group, we asked them to take a week's break from Facebook. And then after the week, we ran the happiness studies or surveys among them again. And to be honest, when we started the experiment, I didn't think we would see any effect because of several reasons. First of all, I thought, well, there's so many factors that impact our life satisfaction. We talk about genetics, we talk about social comparison, about the policies in the different country. So just pulling one lever, I didn't think we would see the needle move on that one. And secondly, if our theory is correct that social media distorts our sense of reality, well, that is a distortion that have been accumulated over years. Like many people, I've been on Facebook since 2008. And just 1 week, I didn't think without Facebook would reset how my view of the world looks. But we did see a significant effect across several metrics. Now, of course, I think most of the people that were in that experiment at that time, I believe they're still using social media today, even though they experienced this. And I think that's due to the fact that a lot of us are sort of constantly battling instant gratification versus long-term goals. Do get a dopamine rush when we see the little red square, and we are curious, we are interested, so that sort of keeps us on. But it's interesting to see how different communities are trying to create different set of behavior around social media, and we definitely need to explore this more, and that's also why we've begun this new study that should be out in the fall.
Well, while we await that study and your response and your share with us, you also wrote a little book called The Little Book of Hygge, or I believe it's also called The Key to Happiness. So it goes under both titles currently. I gave this to one of my colleagues at my office, and I said, do me a favor. I'm going to get to this next week, but check it out. Let me know what a few of your favorite parts were. The following day, normally that takes about a week for me to get back, I get this documented book, man, with 100 different little pieces of paper sticking out of it, and notes and highlights and arrows and all this stuff. Amy, our producer, was blown away by this book. And after I read it, so was I. It's simple, it's easy, and we miss it. So tell us, our listeners, and myself again, what is The Little Book of Hygge really about? What is the key to happiness as you wrote about it?
My first book, The Little Book of Hygge, you mentioned before, that was about this Danish phenomenon that we talked about, the atmosphere, the relaxation, the savoring simple pleasures. The second book, the one you mentioned now, The Little Book of Lykke, I wanted to underline that Danes do not have a monopoly on happiness, and we can find ideas for how to improve quality of life around the world. So it's more a global treasure hunt.
So my friends, Indiana Jones, Meik Wiking, did take us on the global treasure hunt of happiness. He certainly did share practical, simple tips and real-life proven examples that you and I can easily apply in our life in the 6 key areas of happiness that he covers in his books. They include togetherness, money, health, freedom, trust, and kindness. To hear a little bit more about how Shani took her ordinary Australian street and then transformed it into a community less of neighbors and more of friends, or why parents in Portugal and in Spain are happier than other parents around the world, or how Sophie's volunteer experiences propelled her to overcome unemployment and depression, or, and this one perhaps most importantly, how you can apply their experiences to your personal growth, then I invite you to join my Live Inspired membership community. It's called In Studio. I'll share more about the Live Inspired In Studio membership community at the end of this show. Get ready for it. Stay tuned. You are going to want to learn more. Meik, you've been on a wild journey your whole life, but in particular over the last 6 or so years. What's next for you?
I think continuing along the same path. The core questions I mentioned at the beginning that we're trying to answer are still what interests me. And I'm going to spend the next at least 40 years, hopefully, trying to solve them. So I think just continuing where I'm headed, because I'm having a lot of fun in this direction.
Well, brother, there are 7 questions that tether all of our guests together. So I'm going to dance you through these questions quickly. What is the best book you've ever read?
Perhaps one of the ones I read recently, Factfulness by Hans Rosling, a Swedish statistician. I know it sounds horrible, but it's actually very positive and enlightening about the world.
Say the name one more time.
So, Factfulness by Hans Rosling.
Very good. What's one positive characteristic, one trait that you possessed as a little child that you wish you exhibited as brilliantly today?
Optimism.
Great. If your apartment or home, your condo caught fire and all living people, all living things are out, and you have an opportunity to run in and save one item, what one item would you grab?
I know that a lot of people say the same because I've been researching this recently, and I'm going to go with them as well, my photo albums.
Good. If you could sit on a bench overlooking a beach on a gorgeous day and have a long conversation with anyone, living or dead, who would you want to have seated right next to you?
Oh, definitely my mom. So unfortunately, she died quite young when she was 49, and I just have a lot of nice things to say to her.
That's beautiful. What's the best advice that your mother or anyone else ever shared with you?
There's many, but I think what comes to mind also because of this conversation is an advice that John Halliwell gave me. John is one of the editors of the World Happiness Reports. And he told me that when it comes to the work we do in trying to spread knowledge about happiness, the advice is let the data shape the science, but let the story spread the science. And I think that works quite well.
Could not agree more. Meik, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
It's all going to be fine.
It is indeed all going to be fine, Meik. And the final question of the Live Inspired 7, it has been said, Meik Wiking, that all great people, and I have one on the podcast with us right now, all great people can have their lives summed up in one sentence. How would you like your one sentence to read?
My life summed up in one sentence? God. Hopefully just happy.
How appropriate. The explorer of happiness has had his life summed up in one sentence. So the Indiana Jones of happiness, the researcher, the philanthropist, the friend, the great man, Meik Wiking, it has been an honor spending some time with you today.
Likewise, John. Thank you so much for all those great questions.
Meik Wiking, thank you for the time. My friends, thank you for your investment and for this time. And until next time, this is John O'Leary. Live happy and live inspired. Well, my friends, I loved the conversation with Meik Wiking, learning everything that the Happiness Research Institute is doing to change our world and how we can choose to live happier, more inspired lives. You heard Meik Wiking hint about the little book of Hygge and his global treasure hunt for happiness. But we just didn't have enough time to unpack all of it with our time together on this podcast. But there's good news. Join me live on May 20th in studio to hear more about his work and how you can easily apply his lessons into your daily life to elevate your well-being and your happiness. Registration for In Studio opens to the public only a couple times each year. It's open right now for a very limited time only and for about the next 48 hours. Do not miss this opportunity to join the exclusive community and hear more about what Meik says, as this content is not available anywhere else. You're going to want to go here. So visit us right now, learn about In Studio, learn about how it's going to elevate your experience, your leadership, your life, and how you can register for it right now before it closes by visiting me at johnolearyinspires.com/join. Again, it is johnolearyinspires.com/join. I cannot wait for you to join me there in this exclusive community. It's going to be awesome. It's going to set our world on fire with possibility. I'll see you there.